It was late, quiet, routine, until it wasn't. A call came through unexpected, urgent, and deeply unsettling. Prince Louis's nanny, someone trained to remain composed under any circumstance, broke protocol and contacted Prince William directly. Not about behavior, not about safety, but about a question. A single question asked by a palace guest, so disturbing, it couldn't be ignored. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. In a household where hierarchy defines every interaction and information travels through carefully guarded channels, bypassing that structure is not a small act. It is deliberate, it is serious, and it signals that something has crossed an invisible line. The nanny was not inexperienced. She had operated for years within one of the most controlled environments in the world, trained to remain neutral, to manage pressure without emotion, to assess situations without escalating them unnecessarily. For her to reach out directly, skipping layers of private secretaries and household staff, meant the concern was immediate, not something to be filed away for later review. It was not an incident of misbehavior. No raised voices. No breach of security alarms. It was something far more subtle. A question. That is what makes this moment so unsettling. In a palace where routines are rehearsed and access is meticulously screened, the idea that a single sentence could trigger alarm feels almost impossible. And yet it did. The urgency of her call suggests that what she heard carried implications beyond the surface, something that could not safely sit unresolved overnight. The palace is designed to anticipate disruption. Every guest is vetted, every movement tracked, every interaction quietly observed. That is why the suggestion that this particular guest may have had access beyond what was expected raises immediate tension. Access does not expand by accident inside royal walls. It is granted with precision. So how did this person find themselves close enough, informed enough, comfortable enough to ask something that unsettled a trained professional? That is where the story tightens. William did not hear this through a filtered report. He received it personally. And that alone changes the gravity of the situation. When the heir to the throne is contacted directly about a child's environment, about something spoken in what should have been a secure setting, the matter moves from minor curiosity to potential vulnerability. The fact that the trigger was not action but inquiry is what deepens the mystery. Because actions can be corrected, behavior can be addressed, but questions, especially the wrong ones, reveal intention. They expose awareness. They hint at knowledge that may not belong in that space. And within the royal family, where privacy and legacy intertwine, the wrong awareness in the wrong place can ripple outward in ways no one can fully predict. This was not panic. It was recognition. Recognition that something had shifted, however slightly, in an environment that relies on predictability. And once that recognition sets in, it cannot be ignored. The silence after that call likely felt heavier than the conversation itself. Because now there was something to examine, something to trace, something to understand before it spread beyond control. And if a single question could cut through layers of protocol and training, then it must have touched something sensitive enough to demand immediate attention. What kind of question crosses that line inside a royal palace? But to understand why that question carried so much weight, we need to look closer at the one person who heard it first, the nanny who chose to speak up. She was never meant to be part of the story. Always present, yet invisible. Trusted beyond question, trained to observe without reacting. But this time, something changed. Because when someone whose entire role depends on silence chooses to speak, it means something has gone very, very wrong. In the royal household, a nanny is more than a caregiver. She is a guardian of routine, a steady presence in a world that is anything but ordinary. She moves through corridors of tradition and expectation without leaving a trace, entrusted with moments that never reach headlines, absorbing tension without amplifying it. Years inside that environment had shaped her instincts. She understood the weight of proximity. She understood the value of discretion. Most importantly, she understood the difference between something unusual and something unacceptable. She had navigated high-pressure situations before unexpected guests, emotional days, public scrutiny that seeped into private spaces. None of it rattled her. Her training was built around neutrality. Observe. Assess. Contain. Never escalate unless absolutely necessary. That was the unspoken rule. And yet, in this moment, neutrality failed her. Not because she lost composure, but because her composure sharpened into something else: awareness. The kind that settles in your chest and refuses to leave. What she heard did not cause a scene. It did not trigger alarms. It triggered recognition. A subtle but unmistakable sense that a boundary had been approached, perhaps even crossed. Breaking silence in that environment is not impulsive. It is calculated. Before she made that call, there was hesitation. A pause where training and instinct collided. She likely replayed the moment in her mind, testing whether she was overreacting, questioning whether the words could be interpreted differently. That hesitation is critical. Because when someone conditioned to downplay disruption cannot rationalize it away, it means the disturbance runs deeper than surface discomfort. Fear may not have been immediate, but concern followed quickly. Confusion too. Not about what was said, but about how it could have been said at all. Her role demanded emotional control, yet subtle cues betrayed the weight of what she had just processed. A tightening in her voice. A decision made faster than she would have preferred. Urgency not born of chaos, but of clarity. She understood something in that moment that others in the room may not have fully grasped yet. The question was not random. It was pointed. It suggested awareness. And awareness inside those walls is tightly guarded. She did not just hear something strange, she recognized something dangerous. Dangerous not necessarily because of immediate harm, but because of implication. In royal spaces, implication can be more volatile than action. A misplaced word can ripple further than a visible mistake. That is why her choice to step outside her defined role carries such gravity. She transformed from silent observer into active protector in a matter of seconds. And that shift tells us everything. She believed the moment required intervention at the highest level. Not tomorrow. Not after discussion. Now. The unsettling truth is this. Her reaction was not rooted in imagination. It was rooted in pattern recognition. Something about that question fit into a puzzle she may have quietly been assembling without realizing it. A tone. A familiarity. A detail that did not belong. And when those pieces aligned, silence became the greater risk. Because sometimes the most important protection does not come from reacting to what happens, but from recognizing what almost did. And what she heard didn't come from a stranger, it came from someone who had been welcomed inside. They weren't random. They weren't uninvited. This guest had clearance, access, and trust, which makes what happened even more unsettling. Because sometimes, the most dangerous questions don't come from outsiders. They come from those already inside the room. On paper, everything about their presence made sense. The invitation had been formally issued, their name processed through the same discreet but thorough channels that filter every individual who steps beyond the palace gates. Their attendance aligned with the event's purpose. There were no red flags in the briefing notes, no whispered concerns circulating beforehand. If anything, their inclusion seemed ordinary, expected even. That is what makes the tension so layered. This was not someone who slipped through unnoticed. They were welcomed. Granted proximity not just to public spaces, but to areas that carry a different level of intimacy, rooms where conversations are softer, where routines are personal, where the line between public duty and private life quietly blurs. Access inside the palace is never accidental. It is measured, categorized, approved. And yet, access does not always equal understanding. Sometimes it creates opportunity. Their background at first glance appeared steady, professional history intact, social connections unremarkable, nothing that would immediately raise suspicion. But hindsight changes perception. Small details that once felt insignificant begin to shift under scrutiny. A familiarity in tone, a confidence in posture, the ease with which they navigated the environment. None of it alarming on its own. But together, it suggests comfort, perhaps too much comfort in a space that should inspire caution. The interaction itself was subtle. No dramatic interruption. No visible boundary crossed. Just a moment. A brief exchange within Prince Louis's environment. where innocence and security are meant to be unquestioned. The guests did not demand attention. They did not behave erratically. In fact, their composure may have been what made the moment more deceptive, because nothing outwardly signaled danger. The alarm came only after the words had settled. What stands out now is the contrast. A trusted individual asking something that did not match their role. A question that seemed disproportionate to the context. It did not align with polite curiosity. It carried a specificity that implied awareness beyond surface familiarity. And that imbalance between status and inquiry is what began to unsettle those who replayed the moment later. Because inside royal walls, questions are not casual. They are layered with implication. There is also timing to consider. The guest chose that moment, that setting, that proximity. Not in a crowded hall, not during formal conversation, but in an environment where comfort lowers defenses. That choice, whether deliberate or instinctive, adds another layer of complexity. It suggests that the question may not have been spontaneous at all. It may have been measured, positioned carefully within a window where it could pass quietly, unless someone listening understood its weight. And that is where the tension sharpens. Because if the question was intentional, then it was not about curiosity. It was about testing. Testing awareness. Testing boundaries. Testing how much could be revealed in response. And if that is true, then the guest's presence takes on a different meaning entirely. They were not merely attending. They were observing. Calculating. Measuring reactions in real time. The unsettling truth is this: the system worked. Not because it prevented the question, but because someone inside recognized it for what it might represent. Yet recognition does not erase the implication. It only delays its impact. Because once you understand that something may not have been accidental, you begin to question what else may have been intentional. And then came the moment, the exact words that changed everything. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. But it didn't belong. A question so specific, so unexpected, that it immediately broke the calm of the moment. And those who heard it didn't react right away, but they remembered. Because sometimes, the most disturbing things are not shouted, they are quietly asked. The words were delivered evenly, almost casually, wrapped in the tone of polite interest. But beneath that surface was something sharper. The question reached into territory that should have been inaccessible, touching on details that were never part of public conversation. Details that implied awareness rather than curiosity. It was not phrased like gossip. It was not clumsy. It was precise. And precision is what made it dangerous. Inside royal walls, distractions happen constantly. Visitors speak out of turn. Conversations drift. But this was different. It cut through the atmosphere in a way that forced attention without demanding it. The nanny, conditioned to filter out background noise, felt the distinction immediately. Her training taught her to remain still, to avoid drawing significance to something that might dissolve on its own. Yet this did not dissolve. It lingered. The specificity of the inquiry suggested familiarity with private rhythms, with internal matters, with aspects of Prince Louis's life that were never meant to be dissected by outsiders. The context amplified the impact. It was not asked during a formal reception, where questions often blur into rehearsed pleasantries. It was asked in a setting meant to feel secure, personal, guarded. Others were present, but none reacted in the moment. That is often how unsettling events unfold: no immediate explosion, just a quiet fracture. The calm did not shatter. It thinned. And once something thins inside a controlled environment, it becomes impossible to ignore. What made the question chilling was not just its content, but what it hinted at. It suggested private knowledge that had not been offered publicly, knowledge that could only come from proximity or deeper access. It implied that the guest may have understood more than they should. And if they understood, how did they learn? That is the thread that tightens. Because inside institutions built on privacy, unauthorized awareness is more destabilizing than confrontation. The nanny's reaction was not visible at first. She did not interrupt. She did not challenge. But internally, something shifted. Shock registered before concern. Then concern sharpened into calculation. Was this accidental phrasing? A misunderstanding? Or was it a deliberate probe disguised as innocence? The possibility that it was intentional began to form almost immediately. Because the question did not seek information broadly, it sought confirmation. Confirmation about something specific. And confirmation questions are rarely harmless. The idea that this was probing becomes harder to dismiss the longer it is examined. Probing tests boundaries. It measures reactions. It searches for cracks in silence. If the guest was testing limits, then the moment becomes less about curiosity and more about strategy. A quiet strategy, perhaps, but one that relies on subtlety rather than force. That is what makes it explosive beneath the surface. Because intent, when masked by calm delivery, is harder to detect and therefore more dangerous. In that instant, the nanny recognized something others had not yet processed. The atmosphere did not erupt, but it changed. The security of the room no longer felt absolute. And once that feeling shifts, it cannot be restored without scrutiny. Because when a question carries implication, it transforms into a signal. A signal that something or someone may be closer to the truth than they should be. And when the meaning of that question began to sink in, the response inside the palace was immediate. Prince William didn't panic. He didn't react publicly. But those closest to him noticed something shift. Because when someone trained for leadership hears something they cannot ignore, the response is never random, it's deliberate. The moment the call ended, he did not rush into visible action. There were no abrupt orders echoing through corridors, no dramatic confrontations. Instead, there was stillness, a controlled pause, the kind of pause that signals calculation rather than confusion. Those who know him understand that silence is often where his decisions begin to take shape. And this time, the silence was heavier. His first move was containment. Not denial, not dismissal. Containment. He chose to handle the matter personally, bypassing unnecessary intermediaries. That decision alone speaks volumes. In a structure where delegation is standard, personal involvement suggests gravity. It suggests that whatever he heard did not belong in routine reporting channels. It required discretion at the highest level. It required his judgment. But beneath that calm exterior, there was conflict. Caution urged patience verify the context, assess the reliability, avoid overreaction. Urgency pressed harder if the implication was real, delay could create vulnerability. That internal tension is where leadership is tested. Act too quickly, and risk drawing attention. Act too slowly, and risk exposure. William has spent a lifetime preparing for these balancing acts, yet preparation does not remove pressure. It refines it. Quiet instructions began to move through the palace, subtle adjustments, increased awareness around guest movement, a discreet review of access permissions. No official alarm, but heightened scrutiny. The kind that only insiders recognize. Staff sensed it, conversation shortened. Security routines tightened without explanation. Nothing dramatic, yet everything sharper. Because when a potential risk surfaces near family, near children, hesitation becomes unacceptable. What stands out most is where his focus landed. It was not solely on the guest. It was on the implication of the question itself. What did it reveal about access? About awareness? About information flow within the palace? The guest was a variable. The system was the constant. And if the system had allowed proximity to sensitive knowledge, then the issue extended beyond a single individual. That is the difference between reaction and strategy. There were also signs, quiet ones, that this moment did not emerge in isolation. Subtle prior concerns, minor irregularities that never rose high enough to trigger alarm, but existed in the background. Perhaps William had already sensed patterns forming, small inconsistencies that did not yet align. And then the question arrived not as a shock, but as confirmation. Confirmation that something beneath the surface required attention. Leadership often means responding to what others cannot yet see. It means trusting instinct before proof fully forms. And in this case, instinct was not dismissed. It was activated. His composure did not signal indifference, it signaled resolve. Resolve to trace the thread before it unraveled further. Resolve to protect without escalating unnecessarily. resolved to understand whether this was coincidence or design. Those around him felt the shift immediately. Not fear, not chaos, but focus. An intensity that tightened the atmosphere without raising voices. The kind of tension that hums quietly beneath normal conversation. Because once a possibility enters the mind of someone responsible for safeguarding legacy and family, it does not fade, it sharpens. This was not a public crisis. It was a private reckoning. A test of judgment unfolding behind sealed doors. And as measured steps began to unfold in controlled silence, one truth became undeniable. This moment had altered the trajectory of something deeper than a single interaction. And as quiet actions began behind palace doors, the atmosphere started to change. Inside the palace, nothing is supposed to feel uncertain. But suddenly, it did. Conversations became guarded. Movements more controlled. Because when trust is shaken even slightly, it changes everything. The shift was not announced, yet it was unmistakable. An internal review began almost immediately. Not loud, not accusatory, but precise. Guest logs were revisited. Access permissions quietly re-examined. Timelines reconstructed with careful attention to detail. The question itself was not written down in official records, yet its presence lingered in every discussion, shaping the tone of each meeting behind closed doors. Staff who normally operated with seamless confidence now measured their words more carefully. Advisors who rarely hesitated found themselves pausing before offering opinions. No one spoke openly of fear, but concern threaded through the air. The palace functions on layers of trust in systems, trust in screening processes, trust in those granted proximity. When even one of those layers feels compromised, the ripple is immediate. Not chaotic, but controlled tension. The kind that tightens routines without explanation. The most unsettling possibility was not what had been said, but what it suggested. Had a boundary been crossed? Or had it merely been tested? That distinction matters. Crossing implies breach. Testing implies preparation. And if someone was testing limits within royal walls, then the issue extended far beyond a single conversation. Discussions turned toward pattern analysis. Was this truly isolated? Or had there been other subtle indicators dismissed too quickly in the past? Minor irregularities, moments that felt off but lacked proof. Suddenly, those fragments carried new weight. Emotion remained largely beneath the surface, yet it was present. Concern for privacy. Suspicion regarding access. Urgency to stabilize the atmosphere before speculation could expand. The emotional undercurrent was not dramatic, it was controlled intensity. A collective awareness that hesitation could invite vulnerability, and yet escalation carried its own risks. Public exposure of internal concern could undermine confidence in the very structure meant to guarantee security. Quiet efforts to contain the situation accelerated. Communication channels tightened. Invitations scrutinized with renewed caution. Background reviews revisited with sharper lenses. None of it visible to the outside world. The monarchy's strength lies in composure, and composure was maintained. But internally, the rhythm had changed. The balance between openness and protection tilted slightly toward protection. And once that tilt happens, it rarely resets completely. There was also confrontation, not loud or emotional, but strategic. Questions asked internally that may have once seemed unnecessary. Who authorized proximity? How was information managed? Could assumptions have created blind spots? These were not accusations. They were recalibrations. Because institutions built on legacy cannot afford complacency. The realization that even a carefully vetted guest could introduce uncertainty forced a difficult truth: perfection in control is an illusion. And that is where the larger vulnerability emerges. Not vulnerability in defense, but in perception. If a single inquiry can trigger such review, then it reveals how finely tuned and how fragile the equilibrium truly is. Stability depends not on absence of threat, but on awareness of it. This incident may not have caused visible damage, yet it exposed how quickly the internal atmosphere can shift when trust is questioned. In royal life, the most powerful disruptions are often the quietest. They do not explode, they infiltrate. They alter posture. They refine vigilance. And while nothing outwardly collapsed, something internally adjusted. The palace did not crumble, it recalibrated. But recalibration is itself a sign that something significant has occurred. Because when certainty becomes scrutiny, even for a moment, the memory of that scrutiny does not disappear. It embeds itself into future decisions. It sharpens judgment. It narrows tolerance for ambiguity. And that shift, subtle yet enduring, may prove more consequential than the original exchange ever appeared to be. But keeping something contained inside the palace is never as easy as it seems. At first, it stayed inside. But then something slipped. A detail. A whisper. A question no one outside was supposed to hear. And once it did, the story began to spread in ways no one could control. It started in the margins of royal reporting, in the subtle language seasoned correspondents use when they sense movement behind palace walls. A carefully phrased line about heightened internal review. A mention of unexpected sensitivities during a private engagement. Nothing direct. Nothing confirmed. But enough to spark curiosity among those who understand that in royal circles, understatement often masks urgency. From there, the whispers gained shape. Anonymous insiders hinted at unusual concerns surrounding a recent guest interaction. Not a breach, not a scandal, just a concern. And that word, so restrained, so controlled, did more to ignite attention than any dramatic headline could have. Because if there was concern inside the palace, especially involving a child, then something had pierced the protective layers the public assumes are impenetrable. Speculation moved quickly. What was the question? Why did it matter? Was it inappropriate, intrusive, or revealing? The absence of specifics became fuel. Commentators began connecting dots that may or may not have been related. Theories emerged about private knowledge, about access levels, about whether someone had pushed beyond polite boundaries. And the faster the palace remained silent, the louder the curiosity became. Silence, in moments like this, is rarely interpreted as calm. It is interpreted as containment. The speed at which intrigue turned into widespread attention was startling. Social platforms amplified fragments of information into trending topics. Phrases like disturbing question and royal concern circulated without context, each repetition sharpening public interest. The story was no longer confined to insiders. It had escaped into the broader narrative, where imagination often moves faster than fact. Behind the scenes, efforts to steady the narrative intensified. Statements remained neutral. Engagement schedules continued as planned. No visible acknowledgement of disruption. The monarchy's strength lies in continuity, and continuity was maintained with deliberate precision. Yet the more controlled the exterior appeared, the more people wondered what required such control in the first place. Because stability, when overly emphasized, can suggest fragility beneath. Public fascination deepened not because answers were offered, but because they were withheld. The mystery itself became the headline. Who was the guest? What did they know? Why did it alarm those responsible for safeguarding the royal household? Each unanswered question expanded the story's reach. And as it expanded, it became increasingly difficult to draw a firm boundary between rumor and reality. There is a paradox in royal life: the more something is protected, the more valuable it becomes to uncover. This moment, which may have begun as a contained internal review, now carried broader implications. If a single inquiry could generate such careful recalibration, what did that say about the system? About privacy? About trust? The possibility that the truth might be more serious than expected began to circulate quietly among observers. Not necessarily dramatic, not necessarily scandalous, but significant. Because significance in royal contexts is rarely about spectacle, it is about what is at stake. And as public interest sharpened, the palace found itself navigating a delicate balance. Address too much and risk legitimizing speculation. Address too little and allow it to grow unchecked. That tension is where the real pressure builds. Because once the public begins asking its own questions, control becomes far more complicated than silence. And when the public began asking questions of their own, the pressure intensified. What if this wasn't just about a question? What if it was about what that question revealed? Because sometimes, a single moment can expose something much bigger, something that was never meant to be seen. The more this incident is examined, the less it feels like an isolated exchange, and the more it resembles a glimpse behind a curtain that is rarely lifted. The phrasing of that inquiry, its timing, its precision, all of it points toward the unsettling possibility that it hinted at sensitive internal knowledge. Not gossip, not rumor, knowledge. And inside the royal household, knowledge is currency. It is protected, layered, filtered through systems designed to ensure that only those who need access ever receive it. If the guest's words suggested awareness beyond public information, then the concern shifts immediately from discomfort to vulnerability. Privacy within palace walls is not symbolic, it is operational. Boundaries are drawn carefully around family life, especially around children, because the monarchy understands that stability depends on what remains unseen. When those boundaries are even lightly touched, questions arise about how secure they truly are. Was the information inferred, overheard, shared unintentionally, or was it accessed through means no one had considered? The possibility that the guest was testing limits becomes harder to ignore. A test does not require aggression. It requires subtlety. It requires asking just enough to measure reaction. If the question was probing for confirmation, then it was not curiosity, it was calibration. Calibration of what could be known, what could be revealed, what might slip through if pressure was applied in the right way. And if that is true, then the moment becomes far more significant than a single lapse in etiquette. William's response, when viewed through this lens, appears less reactive and more preventive. He did not confront publicly. He did not escalate theatrically. Instead, he reinforced containment, tightened oversight, and ensured that whatever thread had been tugged would not unravel further. Prevention is rarely dramatic. It is quiet, strategic, often invisible to those outside the circle. But its impact can be profound. Because sometimes the greatest crisis is the one that never reaches daylight. There is also a broader layer to consider. Royal access is built on trust in vetting systems, trust in discretion, trust in long-standing relationships. If a single exchange can cast doubt on that trust, then the concern extends beyond one guest. It touches the architecture itself. How many interactions occur each year under the assumption of safety? How many boundaries are maintained not by visible barriers, but by mutual understanding? When that understanding falters, even briefly, the structure must adapt. The realization that this may not have been isolated deepens the tension. Patterns rarely reveal themselves immediately. They appear in fragments. A comment here. A subtle shift there. Individually insignificant. Collectively meaningful. If this was confirmation of an emerging pattern, then the palace is not simply addressing a moment, it is recalibrating against a potential trajectory. And recalibration signals awareness of something larger than what is publicly acknowledged. That is why this story resonates beyond curiosity. It speaks to the fragile balance between openness and protection, between tradition and adaptation. The monarchy survives not because it avoids risk, but because it anticipates it. And anticipation requires recognizing signals before they become headlines. So perhaps this was never just about one unsettling question. Perhaps it was about what that question exposed beneath the surface, a reminder that even the most controlled environments rely on vigilance that never sleeps. And if that vigilance had faltered for even a second, the consequences might have unfolded very differently. And as everything begins to settle, one final question remains. Some moments pass unnoticed. Others leave a quiet mark that never fades. This was one of them. Because what happened that day wasn't just about a question, it was about what that question revealed, and what it may have prevented. In the weeks that followed, there were no dramatic announcements, no visible fractures in royal routine. Engagements continued. Smiles remained steady. The public calendar moved forward as it always does. But inside the palace, something had shifted permanently. Not fear. Not chaos. Awareness. A sharpened vigilance that lingers long after the noise of speculation fades. The long-term implications were not written into policy documents or press briefings. Yet they were felt in subtle recalibrations. Guest vetting became tighter, even when no one admitted why. Access routes were reviewed with renewed scrutiny. Conversations about privacy and internal knowledge carried a slightly different tone. The system did not collapse, it evolved. Quietly. Deliberately. Because when a single moment exposes the possibility of vulnerability, institutions built on legacy do not ignore it. They adapt. For William, this episode became more than a contained incident. It became a defining measure of leadership under pressure. He did not wait for proof to become crisis. He acted in the gray space where intuition meets responsibility. That restraint balanced with resolve revealed something critical about the future of the monarchy. Leadership is not about spectacle. It is about prevention. It is about recognizing the tremor before it becomes an earthquake. And in that sense, this moment did not weaken authority. It refined it. Then there is the nanny. A figure never meant for headlines, yet central to the turning point. Her decision to speak disrupted nothing publicly, yet protected everything privately. She did not seek recognition. She did not dramatize what she heard. She simply understood that silence, in that instant, carried more risk than escalation. From silent guardian to key witness, her role underscores a powerful truth. Sometimes the strongest defense of legacy comes from those who stand just outside the spotlight. The mystery of the guest lingers. Motive remains unconfirmed. Intent remains ambiguous. Was it innocent misjudgment? A careless attempt at connection? Or something more deliberate? A quiet test of boundaries disguised as conversation? That uncertainty is what gives the story its haunting quality. Because without clear answers, imagination fills the gaps. And imagination, especially where royal secrecy is concerned, rarely settles for simple explanations. The monarchy, for its part, absorbed the moment without public fracture. But absorption does not mean erasure. It means integration. Lessons folded into practice. Awareness woven into protocol. The institution has survived centuries not by denying risk, but by evolving in response to it. This was another evolutionary step, subtle, perhaps invisible to most but significant to those who understood what nearly surfaced. Emotionally, the weight of the moment does not disappear. Those who recognized its gravity carry it forward. Not as panic, not as paranoia, but as a reminder. A reminder that proximity to power invites curiosity. That privacy must be guarded not just against action, but against implication. That sometimes the most destabilizing force is not what is done, but what is known. And perhaps that is the final resonance of this story. Some questions are never publicly answered. Some intentions are never fully revealed. But they are never forgotten. They live quietly in institutional memory, shaping decisions long after headlines fade. Because the true impact of that day may not lie in what was said, but in what was stopped before it could unfold. And perhaps the most unsettling truth of all is that we may never know what would have happened if that question had gone unnoticed. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.